So all right. So we have, in addition to our distinguished panelists, presenters, we are joined by Don Meichenbaum, the scientific director of the Melissa Institute, who will also later uh, be be presenting. So we had different questions that have been said. I think all of you can see them also in the Q&A. I know that Colleen, you indicated that you wanted to answer one question there. Would you mind? It's a question that speaks about whether or not people from the state of Florida had reached out to you to bring the program here.
I would say the people who've reached out to me from the state of Florida are on this call. So certainly Dr. Alvarado has reached out, and we've explored some opportunities to think about bringing some trainings and leveraging some of the experiences and things that you have there. There's also some really good work going on in Northern Florida, looking at some of the work that Deborah just mentioned around child-friendly cities and how we might implement the work of UNICEF and others to really think about centering child rights in this conversation about the notion of how do we build these relationships that she just spoke so beautifully about. So nothing formal, but would be more than happy to talk to others about how to do this. We just presented at the state superintendent's organization meeting in Washington, DC. And so there was some interest there in hearing how different states are spending their ESSER funds, for example, and learning from each other. So I think there's a real interest, and especially with these funds that are now available, to think about how do we replicate between states some of the things that have been working. So happy to have those conversations.
That's great. That's in part the purpose of this conference today, to help people guide them in that process. A question here, given all the disturbing news and disturbing realities about shootings in schools, that and firearm safety issues that we've been dealing around, particularly this question for you, what does research tell us about the best ways to increase firearm safety and to prevent school shootings?
That's a big question, but I think there's one simple answer in terms of where to start, and we need the political will and we need the political support to do so. As I pointed out earlier before, we can understand a lot when we are allowed to do research and it's supported by our federal government or by other agencies. And unfortunately, there's been politics has entered the scene and it has frozen funding for firearms research. If we had research, we could determine all kinds of things, and there could be all sorts of innovations. One simple innovation, for example, that people don't think of is gun safety could be accomplished with having something like a fingerprint for unlocking the gun. That would simultaneously, it's completely possible to be able to do that. And that would be a technological innovation that would lock guns except for the individual user, disallowing children and youth to get a hold of it, which is what often happens with school shooters. And stopping the tragic deaths of young children and even infants playing with guns that are unlocked in the home and so on. But in addition to that, there can be many other solutions about I think there are at least 6 or 7 proposals for gun safety that have over 80% of the American public supporting it. And what's waiting for this to happen is to vote out those representatives who are not representing their own constituencies and not representing the larger American public that wants these gun safety changes made. Certain of them are being made in states that have a Democratic control, but many of the Republican-controlled states are reversing those things, making open carry and supporting the use of assault weapons and so on. So it's largely a political issue. Researchers can be very helpful And practitioners can too, if we are only allowed to have the funds to work on this. And if we're not blocked by, I would say I would consider them often cowardly representatives who are afraid to stand up to the commercial and NRA interests with regard to forbidding gun safety measures to take hold in their states. I could go on, but I get the point.
I appreciate very much, Ron, you bring in the political dimension in this conversation because it's a big elephant in the room that cannot be avoided when we're talking about safety, trauma, nurturing, and healing of our communities. A question here that Don, you want to say something?
I just like to add two observations. One is on one of Ron's schools, he indicated that the relationship between the security police and the students was critical since there's often peer warning of this. And in one of the films, he has a wonderful description of how they had a weekend camp with the police as well as the students in order to create a trusting relationship. So I think that, and I'll have more to say about ways to make schools safer without hiring more police or spending money on things like that. The second observation that I'd like to make is I recently had an occasion to present to state representatives. And how do you convince state representatives that prevention is an important investment? I challenge them to count the number of high school students who drop out. It turns out that high school students who drop out make over the course of their life $250,000 less total income than those who in fact graduate. Those who graduate will pay $100,000 in taxes. I asked the state legislature to go to the back of the door of the high school and just count every kid who drops out and go 100,000, 200,000, 300,000. It's estimated that California lost $3 billion in tax revenue of high school students dropping out. So while these legislatures pay lip service of caring for mental health and the like, they're much more interested in dollars. So I think we need to have them appreciate the financial cost of not engaging in the kind of preventive strategies that the panelists have offered. When you get it down to that level, okay, that should be the platform of the people running for president.
I just add to Don's point about the school resource officers. I'd like to invite people to see the videos that I had prepared and that Don referred to. The one he's referring to happened in Grossmont, California. And you can find all of these videos and more in little 4-minute snapshots that are very valuable at the Promote Prevent, one word, promoteprevent.org/snapshots. So once again, we should put it in the chat screen, promoteprevent.org/snapshots, and you can see all of the visuals that were done in the schools and that verify some of the points we're making. And I agree wholeheartedly with Don on the second point that you have to address the legislators where they deal with things, which is the money issue, and come to them where they're most vulnerable and they're most influenceable. Thanks.
Let me just bring the conversation now somewhere closer to the clinical part. We have a question here that says from a good friend of the Institute, Holly Swerling, director of the Fatherhood Task Force of South Florida. She asked, how do we determine where the student is, our client, so to speak, since each child comes with individual issues, trauma perhaps, into our care, into the school. So how do we really determine where each student is? I believe that, I'm thinking maybe Deborah, yeah, go ahead.
I'd be glad to start with that. And the sharing circles or the discussions that Colleen talked about are a good way to do it with high school students. And they, in a group setting, students may not talk openly about how they're feeling, but what the adult who's leading the discussion sends as sort of a subtext is, I care about you. I'm concerned about you. I want to know how you're doing. Also, I think observing children is, especially younger children, but also high school students, is a critical way of knowing how they're doing. Do they come through the door with a smile on their face? Are they exhausted? How regulated are they? How tired are they? And I think that if a child's experiencing serious difficulties, the early assessment risk list, the EARL risk list, helps to think about what are the domains in which that child can use support. Where are they struggling? Where's the family struggling? And how can they use support? So there's some informal observations that you can do. You can create caring relationships by talking to the child and recognizing that child and the backpack that they're carrying, and also do some formal assessments.
I'd love to jump in here too. I think this is where the universal piece is so absolutely critical. I think when our schools can adopt social emotional learning as one of their primary goals, they create a vocabulary and a language for kids, and that safety that Deborah mentioned around how do we, whether it's through morning meetings or check-ins or using, there's a lot of SEL curriculums out there that help children to start to develop the vocabulary and the models to use thermometers and others to help express what they're feeling. And that all of those skills are critical. But what we learned for having done this work for 20 years is focusing SEL just on the students isn't enough. You also have to focus on the adults. And so the adult SEL skills, their ability to bring their whole self into their space, to remember that they are not just educating on the ABCs, but they are those role models, those relationships. And so when adults are open to these kinds of conversations and having and creating the spaces for kids to express what's happening to them, what we see is huge movement for young people. When they know that adults actually want to hear what's happening with them, that makes a big difference. So creating those safe spaces in small group interventions or in classrooms is really critical, but also helping the adults, because many, we know that folks who go into helping careers, like all of us, whether it's education or healthcare, do often bring to the work our own experiences with trauma, our own experiences with managing our emotions. So if we don't create safe spaces for the adults to be honest about their struggles, or to have a mentor to be able to say, this child's pushing my buttons, I feel like I'm getting, I'm responding in ways that are too disciplined and not supportive. All of those things we need to shift. And I think our schools have not made that a priority. But when we looked at that data that I showed you, what we heard number one was that the teachers need the support. And the feedback that we've gotten from them is that they can start to feel some collective responsibility and investment in themselves. They're able to bring their best selves to the work and not feel isolated and not feel judged. And so I think it really begins in pre-service training and educating people to think differently about themselves. But I do believe that if we create opportunities, young people want us to know that they're hurting. And that comes pretty clear when you look at things like the Youth First Behavior Survey. They're telling us they're hurting. And so adults need to be ready to open those conversations and have the resources at their hand, that we're not trying to create mental health professionals out of educators, but we are trying to equip them with their own skills that they bring and the resources to know where to go if they need more or if they feel like their students need more. So I think that's really, it is going to take a big shift in how we think about the pre-service education and the ongoing support of our professionals that work with young people. And it's not just educators. The out of school space is even more challenging because that's a very underpaid, early childhood is very underpaid. So if we're going to think about investing in them as professionals and supporting them, we need to think about creating those opportunities for both professional development, but also mentorship and support and adequate pay so that they can stay in these jobs and sustain these relationships that are so critical for communities to thrive.
Thank you very much. Don, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I would just, in my presentation, I will talk about the critical role of peer nominations as an identification of which kids are most at high risk. Parents and teachers are often the last to know which kids are high risk. And I'll talk about various assessment procedures that could be used.
There's an interesting question from Cynthia Francilon here. And would it be helpful to restructure the buildings where we educate our children in? Any of you can take it.
I'll just jump in quickly and say, I think restructuring them to have some of the spaces that Deborah mentioned, where people can self-regulate by being in groups and then removing themselves from groups, I think is a critical skill. When so many of us have used the word self-regulation, and we find in our early childhood work in Head Start, the number one tool that teachers have adopted out of our toolkit is to create a calm corner, and they love it. We help them build them. They're not complicated, some pillows, some self-regulation little toys and things, but having that space to say, I need a minute and I'm not being put in timeout, it's not out of my control, but actually teaching and modeling that walking away and taking some space is critical. And I think we can create that. And when you see classrooms that have that, you feel it. And if the teacher can model it too, like I'm taking a chill out. I need to listen to some quiet music right now because you guys are pushing my buttons and I'm getting frustrated. That kind of modeling of what self-regulation looks like is critical. And we know that self-regulation is learned through relationships back to the beginning of those infant parent attachments. So I think that number one thing, and for those of us that live in the North, we don't get outside enough. So again, creating opportunities, even encouraging teachers to take a walk outside during lunch. And there's just ways that we need to enter into and out of space and make that a possibility for educators. So they're not in 6 hours with 30 kids all day long, but actually have that space as well. So I would just say encouraging and adopting some creative self-regulation in buildings. Another last thing I'll say is a number of our schools created these nicer student teacher lounges. The teachers said the lounges were yucky. And so they wanted a space where they could actually go and have some downtime and maybe connect with a peer or just be by themselves. And so a little investment in getting somebody to donate some nice couches and some nice tables and some tea goes a long way in terms of helping educators feel like their self-regulation is critical.
Fabulous. Deborah, do you want to add something? Your eyes say that you have something to share.
Oh, I think that was a really wonderful answer by Colleen. I do think we need to think about, we don't think very much about emotional and behavioral regulation for both the adults and the students. And there are times when you just need to cool off. And that underlies everything in terms of child's capacity to be present in the classroom and the teachers. So, there are many ways you can do this, but I think the first thing is acknowledging that it needs to be done. And it's no shame that you're upset and need a couple of minutes to calm down. So we need to look at that differently rather than saying, oh, you go in this corner, we can't have you with other children. It just relays a different message.
Another interesting question here, and I think you mentioned also, Colleen, that you might have something to say about this, is how do you evaluate the mental health of neighborhoods that impact on children's students' trauma? How do you work with the neighborhood community centers to provide services to children after school?
Yeah, I can just jump into sort of how we've done that. I think It's been pretty critical. I also have been a big fan of the phrase, we're not going to mental health our way out of the mental health crisis. There's not going to be enough psychologists and social workers ever. So we do need to think differently about who the important adults are in kids' lives. And that includes thinking about those informal adults in kids' lives. So we've worked with the Girl Scouts, we've worked with Boys and Girls Clubs, we've worked with after school programs, and those leaders do not have as much training as educators do. So if they're spending from 3 to 6 with kids in that less structured time, we absolutely need to invest in them as well. So that's one thing that we've done is really add training. We train every single Girl Scout camp counselor now in trauma. We partnered with them and created materials that then the Girl Scouts made their own, right? Because they don't want to hear from us. Child psychologist in Chicago isn't going to help them. They need to hear from their own peers, but we need to train them and build those trainer of trainers to go out and talk about what are the skills and strategies that work and give people that training. And what we find is it really is well received. And in many ways, the out of school time providers have a lot less micromanagement of their time and less responsibility to things like academic testing. So those young people that work in those fields generally, or the elders that work in those fields that have been unofficial leaders and caretakers for years, really love to get the support. And we found that to be really important. The other thing I mentioned that I think is critical is for those school-based needs assessments, like we talked about the trauma responsive schools, is to have those out of school providers as part of that team. Because they see the kids, they see the communities. Often they're the ones who the parents trust the most, because they're the ones who are with their kids, they pick them up every day and they hear some more positives. And sometimes they're intimidated by the educational system. So we really do need to leverage that and make sure that schools are seen as hubs in communities and not just a place where kids go to be educated.
You know, this is a good moment to let people know that related to this issue, the Melissa Institute is also partnering with the mayor's office here and the Peace and Prosperity Initiative, and we will be providing trainings in trauma-informed care practices to after-school service providers in some of the most difficult neighborhoods in our region. So we're going to be doing that over the next couple of years. We're starting this summer, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to work alongside some of the folks in the audience here today. Ron, there was a question here. Let me think about you. How might advances in technology and artificial intelligence affect cyberbullying and school shootings?
Well, we know it already is in some ways, but one of the things that I think we found out about from Amarillo, Texas, is that the students are way ahead of everybody else and already trying out these new technologies. The ChatGPT, the chat bots, and other things are certainly going to provoke, or at least require that we understand it better, that we know how to combat misuses of it. The misuses could be anything from putting up the voice of somebody that's not real, the image of somebody that's not real, putting words into people's mouths and not knowing how to determine whether it's true or not very effectively. So the invitation, the opportunity for all kinds of cyberbullying is there. I think part of the solution is to begin to involve youth directly in coming up with some of the best ideas and the best interventions. One of them that I mentioned was the AUP, the acceptable use policy, and have them come up with have students come up with their own acceptable use policies to avoid cyberbullying, ways to report cyberbullying if it occurs, ways to defend against it, or to acknowledge, or to figure out whether things are truthful or if they've been put together with artificial intelligence. So I guess I put my my hopes and full confidence in working with youth to come up with the best acceptable use policies for cyberbullying, and it will be an ongoing and changing thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Don, want to give you kind of like maybe a chance to bring this part of the conversation to closure. You have any questions for the panelists or comments that you'd like to make?
Just want to express my deep appreciation and admiration for the services that our three presenters have provided. I'm humbled, and I think society is remarkably beneficial on the initiatives of what Ron did in his position, the direction of what Colleen has done in the state of Illinois. May she be blessed to bring it to Florida. And moreover, the way in which Deb has created PrevNet, and taken her entire program on peer involvement and bystander interventions. I am most appreciative of all their efforts for the Melissa Institute, and will try and supplement the presentations they gave when I'm given the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Remind everybody in the audience that all the materials, everything that's been said will appear, will be uploaded in our YouTube channel in the upcoming days and weeks. And so you have access to it, and you can share it among the people that you know and care about these issues. Share it among the policymakers and people with the power to do things, and in your communities and your school districts. Call your attention to the Belfer Appman Scholarship Award that the Institute has been fortunate to give for many years now. We have the winners this year are listed you can see it on your screen. Carolyn Boyd Rogers, Jordan Tipsworth, and Sarah Godoy. Excellent young scholars. Together, they have over, I believe, 30 publications at this early stage of their lives. Very wonderful group of researchers. The Belfer Appman Scholarship Award winners receive $3,500 in support of their research endeavors, their dissertation endeavors. And at this point in our history as the Institute, we have been fortunate to be able to award over $100,000 on scholarship. So we're very, very proud of this program and proud of the students that have joined us in these efforts. Congratulations to all of you. I ask the rest of the presenters in the afternoon to join us. Thanks also, Don, for 27 years of leadership at the helm of the Institute as a scientific director. All right.
You must appreciate that I show really good judgment in the kind of people I invite to be on the scientific board.
You do.
These are the cream of the crops,
You do.
I mean, that's my best ability, is to have really nice and smart friends.
Good. It's a good sign of resilience. Good booster. All right. So let's move on. In a conversation now with Jim, and we just lost Sherry. Let me see. She'll hopefully come back now. And Don, I have several questions here to share with you, and also give you a chance, as you saw in the morning part of the discussion, for you to ask questions to each other and make comments as you see fit. We have a question here, is that so what advice, I believe this question for Jim, what advice do you have about conducting anger and aggression management group consisting of middle or high school cisgender girls?
Well, it's a matter of sensitivity. If you think about is there a single word or phrase that defines what males who are having anger and aggression problems need? And that might be problem solving. They're just not good at that. Okay. If I was to think of a word that needs to be front and center for working with same age girls, that word would be relationships. And relationships, as Deb Pepler pointed out, needs to be front and center. And relationships within the group need to be front and center. If you're doing one of the manualized anger management programs, and you have a group of 6 young women, it's been my experience that on any given day, if they come in once a week, you've got your fingers crossed that they're still talking to one another. And there can be some difficulties there because relationships are so very important to them. And you can't force that. You can make the therapy room a safe place to be. You can coordinate some collaborative behaviors, but you have to protect their relationships with one another. When we do, we have an activity in the group where I mentioned earlier, where one person stands on one side of the line and the rest of the group stands on the other side of the line, and they tease and taunt that person while that person self-instructs. I can handle this. I can do this. I don't have to get angry. Now that works very well with boys. Boys will do that. They just love doing that. Okay. Girls less so. Because even in that artificial circumstance, they don't want to they have a really difficult time saying, oh, I hate your hair. If they don't believe that. And they worry that the person they're doing this activity with thinks they really do. And that's going to blow back when they leave. So we did some modifications, some interns did some modifications where rather than directly confronting her, rather than saying, yeah, ugly hair, oh, I hate those shoes. What we had them do was had 2 of them whisper in one another's ear while the candidate watches. And behind them, somebody else holds up what they're whispering about. Just a word. They're whispering about hair. They're whispering about shoes. They're whispering about body size. They're whispering about, and the identified group member is self-instructioning and saying, I can handle it. I don't care what they're talking about. I can do this. If they don't like my hair, I can handle this. I can do it. And we give them phrases that they can use, and they work on some phrases themselves. But it's not the direct that we see with. So if you think of that word, when you think of doing work with girls, that notion of relationships, not only with one another, but with significant others in their environment. That relationships with mothers is very important to preteen girls. That's very important. And I would go so far as to say, if you can't work on that, if you have no capacity to work on that, that working with the girls may be contraindicated, because it is the important thing is their relationship with their mother at that age, at 12, 13-year-old age. So
I'll note that
the snap,
I just-
I'm sorry, the one thing, the snap that Dr. Mecklenbaum article, step down plan, that intervention places a lot of emphasis on that. And it requires, you need to travel and get the training. But if you have a large population of young women who you want to do some of the best work you can do with, the SNAP program is a good way to go in that direction.
I don't know if Deb's still around on this, but they had a really nice program on teaching young women how to relate to their mothers and using SNAP.
I'm here, Don. I can't. I've been muted.
Yeah, we're hearing you. Go ahead.
Yeah, we did a whole review and looked at what girls needed that was a bit different than boys. And you're right, Dawn, we implemented a program for girls and their mothers. And the girls were often, and particularly the older girls, we picked up girls who were 9, 10, and 11 for this intervention, and talked about, body issues, physical development, menstruation, and other things with their moms. So it sort of reinforced that relationship. But over the years, we've discovered that it's a really good idea for the boys also to have some of these relationship bonding experiences with their mothers and fathers. So the programs are perhaps less gender sensitive than they were at an earlier point.
Wonderful. I have a question, and please, Deborah, stay there. Don't go away. Question is this from Carla Garcia. She says, since negative outcomes can be disproportionately higher among minority youth, what are the best strategies to bolster resilience among this youth in particular? And I know that it's an issue that Sherry and Don had thought about before. I wonder if you have some thoughts you want to share.
The only thing I would add is we've had presenters, African-American presenters, talk to us and present on how to do the talk with their male adolescent African-American sons. And given the recent violent shootings by police of that youth, I think that kind of discussion about how the offspring of African-American youth in our highly discriminatory environment needs to take place. And I, learn each time the demands on parents and having that conversation that I never had with my sons because I'm Caucasian. I should also add, if you go to the Melissa Institute website, we have developed a bystander intervention program of SNAP for policemen, which is another topic for another conference. But being culturally sensitive in parent training is absolutely the most critical feature in bolstering resilience.
Another question
I
here.
can add to that.
Your internet, I think, is giving you some headaches there.
I think that it's really important that we not
I think we lost. She told us earlier that she was.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear
If I
you.
turn off my video, is my sound better?
Yes.
Yeah, you're okay.
I'm having
Just
some
talk. We know
internet
what you look
problems
like.
at home.
Okay. So go ahead. You can talk now. if you want.
You
I think she's having some difficulty. Well, Sherry, if you connect again,
Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing you all. Can you?
no, we're not hearing you too well. If you want to type, if you want to send a short answer, we can put it on the chat, or simply, maybe we'll figure out another way. Maybe get you through phone here in a minute. Yeah. Okay. I have a question here, Don, that I think it's maybe for you. And
Yeah. Mine went out. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can
Yes.
hear you. Let's go ahead.
so
You
the
want
question,
me-
the question, Don, I'm gonna ask the question to Don, and then while he answers, I'm gonna be Sherry, I'm gonna try to reach you by phone, and then maybe we can make it work that way. Having you on a phone from this end. Okay. How should therapists engage the victimized children's parents in treatment?
Clearly, it depends on the nature of the trauma. You know, if it's a natural disaster or a victimization, whether it's long-term, no matter what the form of the victimization, the research indicates that the most important skill you need is accurate empathy. You need to sort of convey to the parents if they feel comfortable in sharing with you what happened and what lingers from that. How do they think you could be of assistance? So, you know, just be human in response to whatever the parents have gone through. Validate and normalize their reactions and let them lead you. It's like a dance. Make sure that the first issue they have is whoever was victimizing, including themselves, are safe. Safety for both the students and the parents is the first priority. And what is it that you can do to help them ensure that safety? What are the kinds of practical needs they have? I mean, just think of all of these natural disasters and the kind of disruptions. And, you know, so there's a lot of good literature on what's called psychological first aid. And if it's down the road, you know, I've dealt with parents whose children have died of suicide. And, you know, I have to sort of work with them in terms of the aftermath of that tragic loss. And so, you know, the key thing is to be person-centered and put away any kind of evidence-based intervention that's protocol-driven, and find out what they need here and now, and how can you be of assistance. I don't know if that's getting close, but that's the kind of response I would have.
Thank you very much, Don. I'm going to now, I have Sherry on the phone.
But
So she'll be able to give us input that way. Hopefully you'll get it that way. Sherry, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Can you
Sorry
hear
to
her?
get in trouble.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So go ahead, Sherry.
Well, regarding the earlier question about working with Black children or other groups, I do think it's important to be aware that different strengths are going to be more or less important in different groups, and that's one of the reasons why we recommend a portfolio approach, so that you can be flexible in what types of strength or also in how they manifest. I think I saw a question way back about different examples of meaning making, for example. And so meaning making is connecting to something larger than yourself. And for most of us, a lot of meaning comes from working on the mission to reduce trauma or make kids' lives better. But for people in different cultures, like spiritual and religious faith might play a bigger or lesser role. And so I think you just have to make sure that you understand what strengths are important to which groups, and that the way that they express them might look different than it does in mainstream U.S. culture, and be willing to make adaptations around that.
Thank you very much. Since I have you on the phone, let me ask, there's another question specifically for you. It says, how can we better incorporate mindfulness approaches in schools to foster community resilience among students, parents, and teachers?
Well, I think that there are lots of ways that you could do that. I think in terms of making it a part of the daily routine in schools, or part of the weekly routine in schools. And in terms of getting parents and families involved too, you could certainly, if you have like a PTA or PTO organization, you could get it involved with that, or if you could make it part of, days when the parents are coming to see their kids in sports or in performances, or to meet with teachers. I think it's so flexible, because you only really need 5-minute window to introduce it in any setting. So it could be, it makes a great opening, and it's really a great way I've found, because I've started making at the beginning of a lot of my presentations. I've actually found that it's a huge benefit for that, because it gets a lot of people to put their phones down and to like recenter and get back in the room. And so I think it would be a really useful tool that is easily incorporated. It's just a matter of where you think you might be able to squeeze 5 minutes in.
Okay. Thanks. Question, I believe this might be for you, Jim. Is that are there anger management programs for younger, early primary level students?
Well, I'm not big on doing knee-to-knee therapy with 4-year-olds. I think that in my mind, and I think a lot of people's mind, the best program out there is to help the parents learn how to manage their roles with the children. And that being said, probably the best program in that direction is The Incredible Years. And so I would look at Carolyn Webster Stratton's program. It's a lot of different training modules. It is not cheap, but it has a very good research track record. And I'd go in that direction of trying to work with the parents to collaborate with what's happening in the school, so that they are not at loggerheads with what's happening in school. That they don't, and the teacher is not trying to parent the child, and the two. A lot of times, parents need to learn how to interact with the school. They don't know. Their experience with the school comes from when they were a student, and maybe they struggled when they were a student. They didn't have a good relationship with the school. What is important to do is to get that relationship back where it belongs again, and then help that parent to learn what are some good parenting techniques. How do I be a good school parent? What's a good school parent? A good school parent is someone who listens to the teacher and collaborates with the teacher on learning. What does homework mean? If I send a child, this is homework, what do I expect as a teacher? What do I expect will happen at the home? If the parent doesn't know how to do homework, then train. That's a skill, to learn how to train homework. How do you do homework? How do you set up a homework situation so that the child is successful at it and will do it? How can you do that? Other sorts of communications that happen between the home and school. Teaching a parent to be a good school parent, someone who is an advocate for what's happening in school, rather than an antagonist for what's happening in school.
Don?
I'll just note that there is a level of intervention called cognitive behavior play therapy by Susan Nell and others, who use puppet play, art expression, other kinds of techniques to teach kids essentially relaxation procedures, slow deep breathing, how to do turtle. So there are ways that you can work in parallel fashion with the kid and then have the parents watch the intervention or actually teach the parents to do the kind of tools that the kid is learning. That's another way to make the parents a co-therapist in the kinds of self-regulation skills that young kids can learn.
I have a question for you, and I'm going to channel the spirit of some of my friends in the audience who are dedicated to make sure that we don't forget the presence of fathers in children's lives, and that we consider, what's unique about that in promoting healthy relationship, a development of youth. The most of the information we discuss about resiliency and about trauma and so on, really it does not give much of a doesn't elaborate too much on the role or potential role of fathers. And so I wonder if either, and in your work, all of you have really come to that, kind of like make distinctions about that, in what ways fathers are particularly more likely to promote resilience in X or Y ways, or whether or not there are things that we ought to know of fathers in general that could help us understand their role in the process.
There's a whole literature by Michael Lewis and others on how to engage parents, fathers in particular. So I see them as a critical role in terms of modeling. There are clearly, as you know, Etione, a good deal of concern about the fathers, where there's abuse, in the kind of 40% where there's also child abuse, and the way in which the Latinos have a certain kind of credo in terms of what they should do with their kids. So I encourage you to address that from your particular perspective as well.
Oh, so you're putting back the question on me.
Well, you're the wise one here, I think.
No. I mean, we do know that and I am not an expert in the literature, but I do know that the father's presence in their children's lives is a predictor of positive, outcomes in school achievement, in behavioral, in behavioral schools. But the point that I was making is that we often, and I know my friends make all the time when they're in the community, is that we also often don't include that part of the fathers in the conversation, that we leave them out and then design strategies and some of the nudging techniques, for example, that Sherry was talking about. They're not necessarily directed to them, and so that's just is an issue of awareness. I'm not really particularly an expert in that field. What do you think, Deborah? I see you thinking there from the work on nurturance.
I do think fathers are absolutely essential. And from a developmental perspective, you wonder how fathers themselves were raised, because that's what they carry into their parenting. And in the same way that we want to support mothers to be the best mothers they can be, I think we want to support fathers to be the best fathers they can be. And things have, I feel optimistic because things have changed so much in the last few decades, from the point where fathers were, barely involved in the birth of a child or in the early raising of a child, to now fathers being much more engaged and carrying, not an equal, but a much more important role than they did, much more equitable role than they did over the, several decades ago. So I look at the young fathers or the fathers of young children today, and I see quite a different type of fathering than was evident before. So I think there's a great deal of promise there. And we must not forget them, or the other diverse types of families where grandparents are raising children, where there may be two women, two fathers. There are many, many diverse kinds of families that we need to include.
Great, thank you very much. So we're coming to the end of our time together. We spent a whole day here. I want to give each of you an opportunity to kind of like make a closing remark, an observation, something you want to leave the audience with as they close this day. We can start with you, Jim. If
Well, every time I participate in conferences at the Melissa Institute, I come away enthusiastic about trying to learn more about what I've heard, and it never fails that I learn enormous amounts of information and get really excited again. When you get to be my age, is the excitement kind of, but there's so much that I learned today, just today, that it's going to have me going to the internet tomorrow and figuring out and researching it further. So I think that it's testament to the kinds of conferences that Don puts on, that Don pulls together, that they live in your mind months and months afterwards. Okay.
Thank you. How about you, Cherry? Are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. I think I would just really echo a lot of that and just reinforce again that for a long time we thought that if you had a high burden of trauma or adversity that you were really doomed to experience a lot of depression and anxiety, and now we know that whether you're talking about children or adults, that the norm is to be resilient and to still manage to achieve thriving, sometimes even after very high doses of lifetime trauma exposure. So I think it's very hopeful. I think there's so much that we don't know about how your everyday person manages to put together a good life despite all the things that have happened, and that there are many ways that wisdom can be better integrated into the way that we create our systems like schools and our therapy and our advocacy and all of our work at all levels of the social ecology. And that it's an exciting time to be involved in the field.
Thank you. Thank you for that perspective and that observation. Deborah?
No, I echoed Jim's comment on learning, and I've taken pages of notes to sort of jog my thinking and push my thinking. I do see so much cohesion and coherence in the talks. I'm optimistic with the focus on strengths and with getting down to understanding the challenges that individual children and youth face, but also the strengths that they're carrying forward. So we still have a lot of work to do, but I feel quite optimistic.
Thank you.
I would like to add one last note. The #2 bestseller on the New York Times is by Bessel van der Kolk, On the Body Keeps Score. The body also keeps score of resilience. And I encourage people to track down a book called The End of Trauma by George Bonanno. That should be the #2 book. And the last item that I have is I'd like to invite all those who are attending this conference to please email the Melissa Institute and tell us what you've taken that makes a difference in your practice. What, if anything, did you take today that you will share with others? I'm big on sort of getting feedback on whether, in fact, these conferences, in fact, make a difference. So I extend that invitation for you to contact us and let us know what we can do to help you further.
Thank you, Don. And